Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases in American history. Leave a comment from where you are watching, for you are about to encounter a mystery that defies everything we know about the human mind. In the freezing winter of 1867, within the isolated mountains of the Missouri Ozarks, a discovery was made that would forever alter our perception of the limits of human knowledge. Webster County was then a wilderness, where pioneer families struggled with the biting cold and near-total isolation. The oak and hickory-covered mountains stretched for endless miles, dotted only with log cabins, smoking from their chimneys against the gray December sky. It was a place where neighbors could live miles apart, and where the silence of the snow smothered even the most desperate sounds. The Caldwell family had come to Missouri 2 years earlier from Kentucky, seeking cheap land and a fresh start. Josiah Caldwell, a stout 42-year-old man, had built a solid cabin atop a hill surrounded by pine trees that shielded it from the cutting wind. His wife, Martha, a gentlewoman of 37, managed the household and cared for their only son, Timothy, who was then 9 years old. They were an ordinary, hard-working family who grew corn in the summer and hunted in the fall to survive the brutal Ozark winters. Timothy was described by the few neighbors who knew him as a quiet, observant child. He had piercing brown eyes and dark hair that his mother cut once a month. He did not attend school, as was common in the region, but Martha taught him to read using an old Bible and some books they had brought from Kentucky. The boy was a quick learner, perhaps too fast for a child his age, but nothing that drew particular attention in a frontier family. The Caldwell's cabin was about 5 miles from the nearest town, connected only by a narrow trail winding through the pines. During winter, this trail became nearly impassable, leaving the family completely isolated for weeks. It was precisely this condition that would render the events of December 1867 even more inexplicable. Sheriff James Morrison, a Civil War veteran well acquainted with the hardships of life in the Ozarks, received the first report on December 15th. A hunter named Samuel Hayes, passing by the Caldwell property, had noticed something strange. Smoke was rising from the chimney, but there was no sign of movement around the house. In a region where neighbors looked out for one another, even from a distance, this observation was reason enough for concern. Hayes knocked on the door several times, called out for Josiah and Martha, but received no answer. Through the only front window, he could see only indistinct shadows inside the cabin. The door was locked from the inside, which was odd during the day, and there were no fresh footprints in the snow around the house. Troubled by the situation, the hunter decided to travel the 5 miles to town to seek help, a journey that took nearly 3 hours through deep snow. By the time Sheriff Morrison reached the Caldwell cabin in the late afternoon, accompanied by Hayes and 2 other townsmen, the sun was already beginning to set behind the snow-capped mountains. The silence around the property was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through the pine trees. Smoke still rose from the chimney, indicating someone had recently stoked the fire, yet there were no signs of life. Morrison forced the front door, breaking the simple wooden lock. What they found inside the hut would defy any logical explanation and haunt those men for the rest of their lives. The interior of the cabin was impeccably organized, every object in its place, the table set for 3, as if the family were about to have dinner. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. But Josiah and Martha Caldwell were simply gone. Their clothes, personal belongings, even their winter coats remained hanging on hooks near the door. It was as if they had evaporated from the physical world. In the center of the cabin's single room, sitting quietly on a wooden chair, was Timothy Caldwell. The 9-year-old boy stared at the fire, his small hands resting calmly on his knees. He did not react when the men entered. He didn't even blink when Sheriff Morrison said his name. His brown eyes seemed to see something others could not. something far beyond the flames dancing in the fireplace. Morrison slowly approached the child. Timothy was dressed in clean clothes. His hair was combed. There were no signs of hunger or dehydration. He seemed to have been cared for until just minutes before the men arrived. When the sheriff gently touched his shoulder, the boy finally turned, but his gaze remained distant, as if awakening from a deep dream. It was then that Samuel Hayes noticed the walls. At first, he thought they were shadows cast by the fire, but upon approaching with a candle, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. Every inch of the wooden walls was covered in symbols, numbers, and complex equations scrawled in charcoal in a tiny, precise handwriting. These were not childish doodles or random drawings. It was advanced mathematics, complex geometry, symbols none of the present men could comprehend. The equations stretched from floor to ceiling, forming intricate patterns that seemed to follow an incomprehensible logic. There were diagrams of stars and constellations with calculations of astronomical distances, formulas resembling advanced engineering work, and numerical sequences repeating in sophisticated mathematical progressions. All written in the same small script, with the same charcoal pressure, as if a single mind had worked tirelessly to cover every available surface. Morrison tried to talk to Timothy, but the boy answered only in monosyllables, as if words were an immense effort. When asked about his parents, he would simply point to the equations on the walls and mutter numbers in seemingly random sequences. His voice was soft, almost hypnotic, reciting complex calculations, as other children would recite nursery rhymes. Most disturbingly, Timothy appeared completely oblivious to his parents' absence. He showed no fear, confusion, or sadness. He just kept staring at the symbol-covered walls, occasionally raising his hand, as if pointing to specific equations only he could see clearly. It was as if he were immersed in a mathematical world, existing solely in his mind. Hayes found charcoal scattered on the floor, small pieces worn down to almost nothing, evidence of hours or perhaps days of intense work. But Timothy's hands were clean, with no trace of charcoal under his fingernails or on his fingers. His clothes were also immaculate, as if someone had washed and dressed him carefully after all the writing was done. In the cabin's kitchen, food was prepared on the table. 3 plates of still warm stew, fresh bread broken in half, milk that had not yet soured. It was as if Josiah and Martha had vanished the very moment they were about to sit down to eat. Their chairs were still pulled away from the table, as if they had abruptly stood up and simply walked out of reality. Morrison scanned every room of the small cabin, looking for signs of a struggle, blood, or any evidence of violence. He found nothing. The beds were made, clothes folded in trunks. The family's few valuables remained untouched. Even Josiah's shotgun was leaning against the wall, loaded and ready for use, as he always kept it during winter to protect the family from wild animals. Outside, the snow around the cabin told an even stranger story. There were no footprints leading away from the house, only the marks left by the men upon their arrival. Snow had fallen the previous night, covering any tracks that might have existed. But even so, the complete absence of movement signs was disconcerting. It was as if Josiah and Martha Caldwell had simply ceased to exist within the confines of their own home. As night began to fall upon the Ozarks, Morrison made the difficult decision to take Timothy to town. The boy offered no resistance, following the men docilely, as if it were the most natural thing. But all the way back, he kept muttering numbers, his small hands tracing invisible shapes in the air, as if he were still working on equations that existed only in his troubled mind. In the town of Marshfield, Timothy Caldwell's arrival caused a quiet uproar that spread through homes like smoke on the icy wind. Dr. William Hendricks, the only doctor in the county, was summoned to examine the boy at Sheriff Morrison's house. He was a middle-aged man, a medical graduate from Illinois, who had seen many strange cases during his 20 years of practice, but nothing had prepared him for what he would encounter that December night. Timothy sat in Morrison's kitchen chair, his eyes fixed on an undefined point in the air, as if reading invisible words. Occasionally, his lips moved in barely audible whispers, reciting number sequences that seemed to have no end. Dr. Hendricks tried to check his reflexes, test his vision and hearing, but the boy responded only mechanically, showing no real awareness of the world around him. Most disconcerting was that Timothy seemed physically perfect. His body temperature was normal. There were no signs of malnutrition or injury. His heartbeat was regular and strong. It was as if his body were a perfectly functioning machine, while his mind inhabited a completely different realm. When Hendricks asked his name or age, the boy answered correctly, but then immediately returned to his numerical recitations. The sheriff's wife, Eleanor Morrison, tried to offer the boy food. Timothy accepted without hesitation, ate methodically, but his eyes never stopped following invisible patterns in the air. Between bites, he would pause to draw imaginary numbers on the table with his finger, as if each movement were part of a complex calculation that needed completion before the next bite. The next day, Dr. Hendricks returned with Reverend Thomas Walsh, an educated man who had studied mathematics before devoting himself to the ministry. Walsh hoped to decipher some of the symbols Morrison had copied from the Caldwell cabin walls. What he discovered left everyone present in absolute silence for long minutes. The equations were mathematically correct. Not just correct, but they demonstrated knowledge of advanced geometry, astronomy, and even engineering concepts rarely taught at the country's most prestigious universities. Walsh recognized formulas for calculating planetary orbits, equations describing the motion of celestial bodies, and diagrams that seemed to map constellations with impressive astronomical accuracy. Most disturbing was that some calculations appeared to anticipate mathematical discoveries not yet formalized by the science of the time. Walsh found numerical sequences resembling works by European mathematicians he had studied during his formative years, but with variations and extensions suggesting an even deeper understanding of fundamental principles. When Walsh tried to show Timothy the equations, the boy reacted for the first time with something resembling emotion. His eyes lit up, not with joy or recognition, but with an almost feverish intensity. He began speaking more rapidly, his small hands tracing complex shapes in the air, as if trying to correct or complete the calculations he saw on paper. It was then that Timothy uttered his first full sentence since being found. Stars move in patterns that numbers can predict, but numbers exist before stars exist. His voice was calm, almost adult, in the way he articulated concepts that should have been beyond his comprehension. Walsh felt a shiver run down his spine as he listened to a 9-year-old discuss astronomy with the fluency of a college professor. For the next 3 days, Timothy stayed at the Morrison home, but his presence cast an eerie atmosphere over the residence. Eleanor reported that the boy did not sleep at night. Instead, he walked silently through the house, stopping before walls and whispering calculations while drawing imaginary symbols with his fingers. It was as if he were continuing the work he had left unfinished in his parents' cabin. Sheriff Morrison organized a broader search for the missing parents. 12 men from the town combed the mountains around the Caldwell property, following hunting trails, checking natural caves, and investigating abandoned cabins. They found deer tracks, bear tracks, but no sign of Josiah and Martha. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist the same night their son covered the house walls with impossible knowledge. During the search, something else was discovered that deepened the mystery further. In the Caldwell cabin, the equations on the walls began to change. Morrison swore that some symbols were different from those he had seen on the first night. Walsh confirmed that new calculations had appeared, written in the same charcoal, in the same tiny handwriting. But Timothy was miles away in town. The Marshfield community began whispering about supernatural forces, forbidden knowledge, and children possessed by spirits. But Dr. Hendricks, a man of science, insisted there must be a rational explanation. He had read about cases of precocious genius, child prodigies demonstrating extraordinary abilities in mathematics or music. Perhaps Timothy was simply one of those rare cases, and his parents' disappearance was a tragic coincidence. Yet even Hendricks could not explain how a child isolated in the Ozarks, without access to advanced math books or formal education, could develop knowledge defying the limits of known science. And even more disturbing was the fact that Timothy seemed to be losing weight every day, as if the process of thinking in complex numbers was literally consuming his life energy. It was as if the boy's mind had become a conduit for knowledge that should not exist in a normal world, and that knowledge was slowly devouring the child who had once been Timothy Caldwell. On the morning of the fourth day, Eleanor Morrison found Timothy collapsed on the kitchen floor. The boy had spent the entire night drawing imaginary equations in the air, his small hands moving tirelessly until his body could no longer sustain the intense mental activity. When Dr. Hendricks arrived, he found the boy in a state of deep exhaustion, yet his lips still whispered numbers in sequences that seemed to have no end. Hendricks made a decision that would change the course of the investigation. He sent a telegram to St. Louis requesting the presence of Dr. Marcus Whitmore, a specialist in mental illness, who had studied similar cases in East Coast hospitals. If Timothy was suffering from some form of mathematical dementia, Whitmore would be the only man in Missouri capable of understanding the condition. While waiting for the expert to arrive, Reverend Walsh continued studying the equations from the Caldwell cabin. He had transcribed over 200 different symbols and formulas, organizing them in notebooks that filled an entire desk in his home. The work was exhausting and unsettling, as each line he deciphered revealed a level of mathematical sophistication that defied his understanding of what a human mind could achieve. Walsh found that many of the equations were interconnected, forming a complex system that seemed to describe celestial motions with extraordinary accuracy. The notes contained calculations concerning the speed of light, formulas predicting solar eclipses decades into the future, and diagrams charting the positions of distant stars with a level of detail attainable only with telescopes far more advanced than anything available in 1867. But the most perplexing was a series of equations that appeared to describe something entirely outside the realm of known astronomy. Walsh found computations suggesting the existence of dimensions beyond three-dimensional space, formulas treating time as a manipulable mathematical variable, and symbols that did not correspond to any number system known to Western science. During this period, Timothy remained in a semi-conscious state at the Morrisons' home. He ate when fed, drank water when offered, but his gaze remained fixed on invisible points in the air. Occasionally, he uttered phrases that sounded like descriptions of non-existent places. He spoke of the library where numbers lived before they were discovered, or the place where stars learn their true names. Eleanor Morrison reported that the boy spoke languages she had never heard before. They were not indigenous tongues of the region, nor recognizable European dialects. They were complex, almost musical sounds, flowing from his mouth as naturally as English. When Walsh attempted to record these strange utterances, he found they followed consistent grammatical patterns, as if Timothy was speaking real languages from places that did not exist on any known map. The situation grew even stranger when other Marshfield residents began reporting disturbing dreams. Several people dreamed of gigantic numbers written across the sky, equations moving like storm-laden clouds, and an overwhelming sense that something fundamental about reality was being rewritten overnight. The dreams always ended with the image of a dark-eyed boy pointing at stars that should not exist. Dr. Whitmore arrived from St. Louis in a snow-covered carriage at the end of the first week of January 1868. He was a tall, thin man with gray hair and intense eyes that seemed to see beyond superficial appearances. He had studied cases of extreme genius in Boston and New York, documenting children with early mathematical abilities, but he had never encountered anything remotely similar to the case of Timothy Caldwell. Whitmore spent hours silently observing the boy, taking detailed notes on every movement, whisper, and gesture Timothy made while immersed in his unseen mathematical world. The specialist conducted simple intelligence tests, presenting basic arithmetic problems that the boy solved instantly without seeming to even think about the answers. But when Whitmore presented more complex mathematical problems, something extraordinary happened. Timothy didn't just solve the equations, he expanded them, creating variations and extensions that took the calculations into completely uncharted territory. It was as if each presented problem served only as a starting point for mathematical explorations, branching out in infinite directions. Most disturbing was that Timothy seemed to be solving problems Whitmore hadn't even fully formulated. The boy would begin tracing answers in the air even before the questions were completely articulated, as if he could anticipate not only the questions, but also the mathematical implications naturally flowing from each line of reasoning. During one particularly intense session, Timothy suddenly stopped whispering numbers and looked straight into Whitmore's eyes. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried a profound sadness that did not belong to a 9-year-old. "They showed me where numbers are born, Doctor, but now I can't stop watching them grow, and they're getting too big to fit inside my head." At that moment, Whitmore understood he was not dealing merely with a case of early genius. Timothy Caldwell had become something beyond normal medical comprehension, a mind that had transcended ordinary human limits and was now paying a terrible price for this impossible knowledge. Dr. Whitmore decided to conduct an experiment that would forever change his understanding of the limits of the human mind. On the morning of January 15th, he brought a blackboard and chalk to the Morrison home, determined to document exactly how Timothy processed complex mathematical information. What he witnessed in the following hours challenged everything medical science knew about human intelligence and cognition. Whitmore began by writing a simple equation on the blackboard, a geometry problem that would normally take an experienced mathematician a few minutes to solve. Timothy stared at the symbols for only 3 seconds before standing and approaching the blackboard. His small hands picked up the chalk with precise, almost mechanical movements and began writing the solution. But he didn't stop at the simple answer. The boy continued writing, expanding the original equation in directions Whitmore had never considered. He derived secondary formulas, created 3-dimensional extensions of the problem, and then developed practical applications for engineering or astronomy. All of this in less than 10 minutes, with perfect handwriting that never hesitated or made corrections. When the blackboard was completely covered with symbols, Timothy simply dropped the chalk and returned to his chair, his eyes once again lost in contemplation of invisible patterns. It took Whitmore over 2 hours to verify all the calculations, and he found every line to be mathematically perfect. There were no errors, no logical gaps, just an inexorable progression of mathematical reasoning that seemed to flow naturally from the boy's mind. But the most disturbing part came when Whitmore tried to repeat the experiment the next day. Timothy refused to touch the chalk, merely pointing to different sections of the already filled blackboard and whispering, "It's already finished. It was always finished. The numbers don't change just because we write them again." It was as if the boy could see all mathematical possibilities at once, making the physical process of problem-solving unnecessary. During these sessions, something else was observed that made everyone present deeply uneasy. As Timothy worked with the numbers, small objects in the room seemed to vibrate subtly. Morrison's wall clock ran a few minutes slow. Candles extinguished for no apparent reason, and the room temperature dropped noticeably. It was as if the boy's intense mental activity was affecting the physical world around him in ways science couldn't explain. Reverend Walsh, watching these experiments with increasing fascination, began developing a disturbing theory. He believed Timothy was not merely solving mathematical problems, but rather accessing a realm of knowledge existing independently of physical reality. The equations the boy produced were correct, because he was reading directly from what Walsh began calling the universal library of numbers. This theory gained credibility when Walsh compared Timothy's equations with ancient mathematical texts he had studied. He found striking similarities with the work of 12th century Arab mathematicians, formulas echoing discoveries by 7th century Indian scholars, and even symbols resembling notations from lost Greek manuscripts. It was as if Timothy had access to all mathematical knowledge humanity had ever developed, plus extensions not yet discovered. But the price of this knowledge was becoming increasingly evident. Timothy was steadily losing weight. His skin turned a sickly pallor, and dark circles under his eyes made his face look much older than his 9 years. He ate less and less, seemed to sleep only a few hours a night, and his voice grew weaker each day. Eleanor Morrison reported that Timothy had begun talking about the final equation, a formula he needed to complete before the numbers stopped making sense. When asked what this meant, the boy just smiled sadly and said that some truths were too big to fit in small minds like his. This answer chilled everyone who heard it, for it came from a child demonstrating intelligence far beyond any adult present. During the 3rd week of January, Timothy had his first breakdown. Whitmore found him convulsing on the floor of Morrison's office. His eyes rolled back, showing only white, while his mouth muttered equations at an impossible speed. The seizures lasted almost 10 minutes, and when they finally stopped, the boy remained unconscious for over 6 hours. When Timothy finally awoke, something had fundamentally changed. His voice was weaker, but his words carried a frightening clarity. He looked directly at Whitmore and said, "Doctor, I know where my parents went. They are in the place where impossible numbers live, and I will find them as soon as I finish solving the last equation." Whitmore felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't just what Timothy had said, but the way he said it, with an absolute certainty that admitted no questions. It was as if the boy had developed an understanding of reality that completely transcended normal human experience, and that understanding was literally consuming his life. That evening, Whitmore wrote in his personal diary, "I am dealing with something that defies every known medical category. Timothy Caldwell is not simply a child prodigy. He has become a conduit for knowledge that may be beyond human capacity to process. I fear I am witnessing not only an extraordinary medical case, but the gradual end of a young mind that has been exposed to devastating cosmic truths." Word about Timothy Caldwell began spreading beyond Webster County. Dr. Whitmore had sent correspondence to colleagues at universities in Chicago and New York, describing the case as a manifestation of intelligence transcending the known parameters of human neurology. His letters attracted the attention of academics who traveled hundreds of miles through the harsh winter to witness firsthand the phenomenon occurring in the Missouri Ozarks. Professor Jonathan Hartwell from the University of Chicago was the first to arrive. He was a renowned mathematician who had studied cases of early genius in Europe and hoped to find simply a child with exceptional abilities. What he discovered left him speechless for almost a full hour. Timothy didn't just solve complex mathematical problems. He seemed to reshape the very foundations of mathematics as he worked. Hartwell brought with him problems he had developed specifically to test the limits of exceptional mathematical minds. Equations that took his university students weeks to solve. Theorems requiring knowledge of multiple advanced mathematical disciplines. Timothy examined them for a few seconds, and then began writing down solutions that not only answered the questions, but expanded the problems in completely new directions. Most impressively, Timothy seemed to understand the philosophical implications of each equation. When Hartwell presented a problem about mathematical infinity, the boy not only provided the technical solution, but also commented on the different personalities of infinities as if they were living entities with distinct characteristics. His description of abstract concepts using almost poetic language completely baffled the university professor. During one particularly intense session, Timothy suddenly stopped working and looked directly at Hartwell. "Professor," he said in his weakening voice, "you are trying to measure the ocean with a teaspoon. The numbers I show you are just the waves on the surface. Underneath is something much bigger and darker than any human mind should ever try to comprehend." These words sent a shiver down the spine of everyone present. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the way Timothy pronounced them with a deep melancholy that seemed to carry the weight of terrible knowledge. It was as if the boy was warning the adults about dangers only he could perceive, dangers inherent in the very act of seeking ultimate mathematical truths. Hartwell decided to try a different approach. Instead of presenting problems for Timothy to solve, he asked the boy to explain how he saw the numbers in his mind. The response he received was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Timothy described numbers as living creatures inhabiting the spaces between spaces, entities existing independently of physical reality and occasionally manifesting through receptive minds. According to Timothy, he did not invent or discover equations. Instead, he would visit the place where numbers lived and simply transcribe what he saw there. It was a realm he described as an infinite library, where each book contained all the mathematical possibilities of a specific universe. His job consisted of translating these cosmic truths into symbols that human minds could, at least theoretically, understand. But there was a terrible price for these visits. Timothy explained that each time he accessed this mathematical realm, a part of his humanity was left behind. He was gradually becoming less human and more of an extension of the very equations he studied. That was why he was losing weight, why he slept less and less, and why he felt a growing sadness he couldn't fully explain. Most alarmingly, Timothy began to describe other inhabitants of this mathematical realm. He spoke of those who came before, human minds drawn to the same forbidden knowledge throughout history. Some were ancient mathematicians, whose names were lost to time. Others were children like him, who had manifested similar abilities in different times and places. "My parents are there now," Timothy said during one session with Hartwell. "They didn't disappear from the cabin. They were translated, transformed into part of the equations I am learning, and I will meet them as soon as I complete the work I have begun." His voice carried an absolute certainty that chilled the blood of all who listened. Hartwell tried to argue that this was impossible, that numbers were abstract concepts incapable of physically interacting with human beings. But Timothy only smiled sadly and pointed to the walls of the Morrison house, where mathematical symbols had begun appearing overnight, written in the same tiny hand, even when the boy was asleep under constant observation. The Marshfield community was growing increasingly restless. Reports of strange dreams multiplied. People woke with fragments of equations in their memory, unable to explain their origin, and some residents began finding mathematical symbols scribbled in their own homes during the night. It was as if Timothy's presence was infecting the entire town with echoes of his impossible knowledge. Reverend Walsh, deeply disturbed by these occurrences, began to wonder if he was witnessing something that completely transcended normal scientific understanding. He began referring to Timothy's case as an open window into realms that should remain closed to the human mind, and started to fear that the boy's continued presence in Marshfield might have consequences no one could foresee. Meanwhile, Timothy continued his gradual deterioration, but his mathematical mind grew more powerful and more alien every day. It was as if he was slowly transforming into something no longer completely human. A living bridge between our world and the impossible realm where pure numbers existed in their most absolute and terrifying form. At the end of January 1868, Dr. Benjamin Ashford, a neurologist from Boston who had studied cases of early dementia and rare brain disorders, arrived in Marshfield. Ashford brought with him medical instruments more sophisticated than anything available in Missouri, determined to find a physical explanation for the Timothy Caldwell phenomenon. What he discovered during his examinations would forever change his understanding of the limits of human brain anatomy. Using a newly developed ophthalmoscope, Ashford examined Timothy's eyes and found something that left him completely baffled. The boy's pupils reacted normally to light, but there were strange patterns in the iris that seemed to change subtly during observation. Even more disturbing, when Timothy was deeply focused on his mental calculations, small blood vessels in the whites of his eyes seemed to form temporary geometric patterns, as if the blood itself was being rearranged by unknown forces. During the physical examination, Ashford discovered that Timothy's body temperature varied inexplicably. When the boy was solving simple math problems, his temperature remained normal. But during moments of greatest mental intensity, when he accessed deeper knowledge, his temperature dropped dramatically, reaching levels that should have caused severe hypothermia. However, Timothy showed no discomfort or symptoms associated with extreme cold. Most alarming was when Ashford tried to measure Timothy's brain activity using rudimentary techniques available at the time. He observed that during periods of increased mathematical activity, the boy's pulse became extremely slow, almost imperceptible, as if his body was entering a state of deep hibernation, while his mind operated at impossible levels of intensity. Ashford documented that Timothy seemed to be developing a completely new neurological anatomy. The reflex responses were abnormal, but in ways that suggested evolution rather than deterioration. It was as if the boy's brain was reorganizing itself to process kinds of information that normal human brains simply couldn't handle. During these weeks of intensive exams, Timothy began to demonstrate skills that completely transcended any known medical category. He could predict with absolute accuracy when specific events would occur in the city, when clocks would stop working, when snowstorms would begin, and even when specific people would get sick. His predictions were always correct, and they were always based on mathematical calculations that he performed mentally. Professor Hartwell was particularly impressed when Timothy predicted a lunar eclipse that was not recorded in any astronomical almanac of the time. The boy provided not only the exact date, but also the precise duration of the eclipse and the percentage of the moon that would be obscured. When the event occurred exactly as predicted, Hartwell realized that he was dealing with a mind that had completely transcended the normal human limitations of temporal perception. But these extraordinary demonstrations came at a devastating cost. After each successful prediction, Timothy grew even weaker. His voice became more whispering, and his eyes developed a glazed quality that suggested he was seeing realities that existed beyond the physical world. It was as if each use of his impossible abilities consumed an essential part of his humanity. During a particularly cold February night, Timothy had his second major seizure. This time, the convulsions were accompanied by phenomena that left all observers in a state of absolute shock. As his body writhed on the floor of the Morrison living room, objects in the house began to vibrate in harmony with his movements. Books fell from the shelves, glass cracked for no apparent reason, and the wall clock stopped at exactly 11:43 minutes. Even more disturbingly, during the most intense moments of the upheaval, observers reported that they could briefly see mathematical symbols floating in the air around Timothy, as if his mental equations were temporarily materializing in physical space. Eleanor Morrison swore she saw luminous numbers dancing like ghosts around the boy's convulsing body. When the seizure finally ceased, Timothy remained unconscious for nearly 12 hours. During this time, he spoke continuously in his comatose state, reciting equations at impossible speeds and occasionally pronouncing names in languages that no one could identify. Dr. Ashford tried to record these utterances, but found that his pen refused to write correctly, as if some force was interfering with his ability to document what he heard. When Timothy finally awoke, something fundamental had changed in his eyes. The melancholy sadness had been replaced by a terrible clarity, as if he had finally fully understood his situation and accepted his fate. His first words were addressed directly to Dr. Whitmore. "Doctor, I know exactly when I am going to die, and I know that my death will not really be an end, but a transformation into something that human minds cannot comprehend." The silence that followed this statement was absolute. Everyone present felt an inexplicable cold run down their spines, because Timothy's words carried a certainty that did not admit of question. It was as if the boy had developed a perception of reality that included not only the present and the future, but also a thorough understanding of his own cosmic nature. That evening, Dr. Ashford wrote in his medical report, "Patient Timothy Caldwell represents a phenomenon that defies all known neurological categories. His condition appears to be less of a disease and more of a forced evolution into a state of existence that completely transcends normal human biology. I am convinced that we are witnessing not only an extraordinary medical case, but a fundamental transformation of a human consciousness into something completely different." During the first week of March 1868, Timothy Caldwell made a request that left all the experts assembled at Marshfield deeply uneasy. He wanted to return to his parents' cabin to complete the final equation. His voice, now reduced to a barely audible whisper, carried an urgency that suggested time was quickly running out for something only he fully understood. Dr. Whitmore initially vehemently opposed the idea. Timothy's physical condition had deteriorated dramatically in recent weeks. The boy now weighed less than 20 pounds. His skin had acquired a translucent pallor that left his veins visible like gloomy maps, and his eyes had developed a disturbing luminous quality that seemed to glow with its own light during moments of greatest mathematical concentration. But Timothy insisted with a determination that transcended his physical frailty. "The equation needs to be finished where it started," he explained during one of the sessions with Professor Hartwell. "The numbers my parents have become are waiting in the cabin. They can't rest until I complete the work we started together that first night." His words carried an absolute certainty that made even the most die-hard skeptics reconsider their position. After days of intense debate among experts, a decision was made. Timothy would be taken back to the Caldwell cabin, but under constant medical supervision. Dr. Ashford organized an expedition that included portable medical equipment, supplies for several days, and qualified observers to document anything that might happen during what everyone secretly feared would be the final phase of the extraordinary Timothy Caldwell case. The journey back to the Ozarks was made in a specially equipped carriage with heavy blankets and portable heaters. Timothy remained conscious throughout the trip, his eyes fixed on the oncoming snow-capped mountains. Occasionally, he would point to specific rock formations and whisper calculations about angles and distances that seemed to have special meaning to him, as if he were navigating through an invisible mathematical map. When they finally arrived at the Caldwell estate, an extraordinary scene awaited them. The cabin remained exactly as it had been left 2 months earlier, but the equations on the walls had multiplied exponentially. Each wooden surface was now completely covered in symbols, numbers, and diagrams that stretched out in complex patterns that seemed to pulsate with a life of their own when observed under candlelight. Professor Hartwell was impressed to discover that many of the new equations represented mathematical developments which he recognized from theoretical work still being developed in European universities. It was as if the cabin had become a repository for all the mathematical knowledge that humanity was destined to discover in the coming decades, or perhaps centuries. Timothy entered the cabin with faltering steps, but his eyes immediately lit up with an intensity he hadn't shown in weeks. He walked directly to a specific section of the wall where the equations seemed denser and more complex. "Here," he whispered, gently touching the symbols with his frail fingers. "This is where they are waiting. Mom and Dad have become part of this equation, and now I need to join them." What happened in the following hours would defy any attempt at rational explanation. Timothy began writing on the wall using a piece of charcoal that seemed to have magically appeared in his hand. But this time, he wasn't simply transcribing numbers he saw in his mind. He was creating something completely new, a formula that seemed to synthesize all the equations in the cabin into a single, all-encompassing mathematical expression. While working, extraordinary phenomena began to occur around the cabin. The air temperature fluctuated dramatically. Small objects began to levitate briefly, and strange sounds echoed from the wooden walls, as if the very structure of the house was vibrating at impossible frequencies. Dr. Ashford tried to measure these anomalies with his instruments, but found that all the equipment failed simultaneously whenever Timothy reached moments of higher concentration. Most disturbing was that Timothy seemed to be visibly aging as he worked. His hands, which had always been small and delicate, developed wrinkles and age spots. His dark hair began to show gray strands, and his posture curved like that of a very old man. It was as if each symbol he wrote consumed years of his life, compressing decades of existence into hours of intense mathematical work. Professor Hartwell tried to argue, but Timothy raised a frail hand to silence him. "Professor, the numbers don't lie. They showed me exactly what will happen, and when, and why. My parents are waiting for me in the realm where the equations live, and soon I will join them. But before that, I need to complete the bridge that will allow others like me to find their way." That night, as Timothy continued his work under the dim light of candles that never seemed to be completely consumed, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that transcended any known scientific or medical category. It was a fundamental transformation of the very nature of human consciousness, and none of them were prepared for the implications of what they were observing. At dawn on the second day in the Caldwell cabin, Timothy Caldwell reached a state of transformation that left all observers in absolute silence of terror and fascination. His features had changed drastically during the night. The face that had once belonged to a 9-year-old now carried deep lines of age, as if decades of life had been compressed into hours of intense mathematical work. His eyes, once brown and childish, now shone with a silvery luminosity that seemed to radiate impossible cosmic knowledge. Professor Hartwell documented that Timothy had neither slept nor eaten for the past 24 hours, but paradoxically seemed more energized than in previous weeks. It was as if he was feeding directly on the mathematical energy flowing through his transformed mind. His hands, now marked by deep wrinkles that contrasted grotesquely with his still small body, moved with mechanical precision as he completed entire sections of complex equations. The final equation Timothy was building now took up an entire wall of the cabin. It was a mathematical expression of incomprehensible complexity, which seemed to synthesize not only all the calculations he had produced over the past few months, but also concepts that completely transcended the mathematics known to mankind. There were symbols that did not correspond to any terrestrial numerical system, diagrams that described impossible geometries, and formulas that seemed to describe the very fundamental structure of reality. Dr. Whitmore tried to copy sections of the equation for later analysis, but discovered something disturbing. Whenever he tried to reproduce the symbols, his hand refused to obey. It was as if the very nature of the mathematics Timothy was creating resisted being transcribed by minds that had not undergone the same extraordinary transformation. The symbols seemed to exist only when written by the boy's hand, disappearing or distorting when anyone else tried to copy them. During the afternoon, Timothy paused from his work and addressed the observers for the last time with a voice that now carried impossible harmonies, as if multiple voices were speaking simultaneously through his childlike vocal cords. The bridge is almost complete. You came here to study a mystery, but you actually became witnesses to an evolution. I'm no longer Timothy Caldwell, and soon I won't be human anymore at all. His words caused a collective shiver among all those present. It wasn't just what he said, but the way he said it with a cosmic authority that completely transcended his physical age. It was as if an ancient, vast intelligence was speaking through the body that had once belonged to a simple child of the Missouri Ozarks. My parents are waiting for me on the other side, Timothy continued, his silver eyes fixed on a point beyond the physical world. They have become part of the eternal mathematics that governs all possible realities. And now I will join them, but not before leaving a path for others like me to find knowledge when they are ready to pay the price it demands. Professor Hartwell tried one last time to establish some kind of scientific dialogue. Timothy, he said gently, you are still a child. There are limits to what any human mind can process. Maybe it's time to stop and rest. But Timothy only smiled with an expression that contained millennia of melancholy wisdom. Professor, he replied, you still think in terms of human limitations, but I transcended those limitations a long time ago. What you call Timothy Caldwell was just the initial vessel for something much bigger and older. Now that container has served its purpose, and it's time to take the next step in evolution. At that moment, impossible phenomena began to occur around the cabin. The temperature dropped to levels that should have been lethal, but none of the observers felt cold. Objects began to levitate spontaneously, spinning in complex orbits that seemed to follow the equations Timothy had written on the walls. Strange sounds echoed through the wood, as if the very structure of the hut was singing in mathematical harmonies. Most disturbing was that Timothy began to gradually become translucent. His skin, already pale beyond normal, began to acquire an ethereal quality that allowed observers to see through him as if he were made of solidified mist. It was as if he was literally dissolving into the mathematics he had created, becoming part of the equations that covered the walls around him. Dr. Ashford tried to use his medical instruments to measure Timothy's vital signs, but found that all the equipment failed completely. It was as if the boy had transcended not only normal biological limits, but also the very physical laws that governed material existence. He was still present. He could still speak and move, but he was clearly no longer made of the same substance as other human beings. During the final hours of that second day, Timothy worked with feverish intensity to complete the last symbols of his final equation. Each mark he made on the wall seemed to consume him a little more, as if he was literally transforming into the numbers he wrote. His voice became a barely audible whisper, but his words still carried the weight of terrifying cosmic truths. It's almost finished, he muttered as he added the final symbols. The bridge between the human world and the realm of pure numbers is almost complete. Others will come after me, other young minds who will be called to the same knowledge. And when that happens, they will be able to use the path I'm creating to make the crossing without so much suffering. As night fell over the Ozarks for the second time since their arrival at the cabin, all observers realized that they were about to witness something that would forever change their understanding of the nature of reality and the limits of human consciousness. On the third and final night at the Caldwell cabin, Timothy completed his final transformation in a way that defied every known law of physics and human biology. At 3:42 in the morning, he put the last symbol into his monumental equation and turned to the observers with a smile that carried both infinite sadness and impossible cosmic wisdom. "It's finished," he said, his voice now only a distant echo of what it had once been. "The bridge is complete, and the way is open. My parents can finally rest, and I can join them in the place where the numbers lived before they became reality." His words floated through the air of the hut like distant music, carrying harmonies that made the hair of the observers stand on end involuntarily. What happened in the following moments was documented by 4 qualified witnesses, but it remains to this day as one of the most unexplained events in American medical and scientific history. Timothy Caldwell simply began to disintegrate, but not into normal physical decomposition. He dissolved into particles of silvery light that danced in the air like cosmic dust. Each fragment shone with the intensity of a distant star. Professor Hartwell tried to get closer, but found it impossible to touch the luminous particles. They existed in a state that transcended normal physical matter, visible but intangible, as if Timothy was transforming into a type of energy that the human senses could perceive, but not fully comprehend. The dissolution was gradual, starting with the fingers of the hands and slowly spreading to the rest of the body. Throughout the process, Timothy kept talking, his consciousness remaining intact, even as his physical form disintegrated. "Don't be afraid," he whispered, as his hands turned to light. "Death, as you understand it, is just an illusion created by limited minds. I'm not dying. I'm simply shifting to a form of existence that allows direct access to the mathematical knowledge that governs all realities." Dr. Whitmore watched with scientific fascination mixed with absolute terror as Timothy explained what was happening to him. "You see dissolution, but I see integration. I'm becoming part of the equations I've written, becoming a living component of universal mathematics that connects all possible worlds. It is the final evolution of human consciousness when exposed to truths that are too great to be contained in biological bodies." The particles of light that had been Timothy began to move in complex patterns that mirrored the equations on the walls of the cabin. It was as if he was physically demonstrating the mathematical concepts he had spent months developing. Observers could see literally how abstract numbers could manifest as forces that transcended ordinary material reality. "My parents are here," Timothy said, his voice now echoing from all directions simultaneously. "They are waiting for me in the place where all possible equations coexist in perfect harmony. Josiah and Martha Caldwell have become part of the infinite library, where all mathematical knowledge resides before it is discovered by receptive minds in physical worlds." Dr. Ashford tried desperately to record what was happening with his medical instruments, but all the equipment failed completely. It was as if Timothy's transformation was taking place in a realm that existed beyond the normal scientific measurement capacity. The devices simply could not process or quantify an event that transcended known physical categories. "Professor Hartwell," Timothy's voice continued, now coming from the very equations on the walls, The knowledge I have shared with you is only the beginning. There will be others, other children in distant places, and future times, who will be called to the same fate. When that happens, they will be able to use the formulas I left as a map to navigate the transformation with less suffering. The particles of light that had been Timothy's body began to move toward the walls of the cabin, gradually integrating with the mathematical symbols he had written during months of intense work. It was as if he was literally becoming part of his own mathematics, transforming himself from a creator to an integral component of the equations he had developed. "Don't forget," his voice whispered, as the last few particles of light merged with the numbers on the walls, "that the reality you perceive is just one of the infinite mathematical possibilities that exist. Timothy Caldwell was only a temporary name for a consciousness that has now embraced its true cosmic nature. And from the place where I now dwell, I will continue to guide those who seek the same knowledge." When the last fragment of light had completely integrated with the equations, absolute silence descended over the hut. But it was a silence that pulsated with mathematical energy, as if the very structure of reality had been subtly altered by the transformation that had just taken place. The symbols on the walls now glowed with a soft, silvery light, as if they had absorbed the luminous essence that Timothy had become. Professor Hartwell looked around the now empty cabin and realized that he had witnessed something that would forever change his understanding of the limits of human consciousness and the fundamental nature of reality. Timothy Caldwell had completed a journey that transcended any known scientific category, transforming himself from child prodigy into something that existed beyond normal human biology. On the walls of the hut, the equations continued to glow softly, as if they were waiting for the next traveler who would be called on the same extraordinary journey through the mathematical mysteries of the cosmos. In the weeks following Timothy Caldwell's transformation, the Ozarks cabin became a place that defied all attempts at rational explanation. The equations on the walls continued to glow with that soft, silvery light, and new symbols appeared occasionally during the night, written in the same tiny handwriting that Timothy had used, even without any physical presence to hold the charcoal. Professor Hartwell remained in the region for another month, meticulously documenting all the phenomena that continued to occur. He discovered that the equations were not static, as he had initially thought. They were constantly evolving with new calculations, appearing as natural extensions of the original work. It was as if Timothy's transformed consciousness was still active, developing advanced mathematics from his new state of existence. Most disturbingly, other people in the region began to demonstrate inexplicable mathematical skills. Children who had never been to school began to solve complex arithmetic problems. Illiterate adults began to draw sophisticated geometric patterns on the earth, and several families reported dreams where a child's voice taught them mathematical concepts that transcended their formal education. Dr. Whitmore arranged interviews with all Webster County residents who had reported anomalous experiences. He found that the manifestations followed a specific pattern. They were most intense among people who had a natural predisposition for mathematics, but they still affected virtually everyone who lived within a 50-mile radius of the Caldwell's cabin. It was as if Timothy, in his new form, was gradually expanding his influence across the region. A particularly notable case was that of Sarah Mitchell, a 7-year-old girl who lived about 20 miles from the cabin. Her parents reported that she had begun solving complex equations using twigs and rocks, creating calculations in the backyard dirt that were mathematically correct, but completely beyond her education. When asked where she had learned such concepts, Sarah simply said that the bright boy taught her during dreams. Dr. Ashford conducted medical examinations on several of these affected children and discovered subtle but consistent neurological changes. all showed increased brain activity in the regions associated with mathematical processing, and some developed the same luminous quality in their eyes that Timothy had manifested during his transformation. However, none showed the signs of physical deterioration that had characterized the original case. Reverend Walsh, deeply disturbed by these developments, began to theorize that Timothy had created something he called mathematical contagion. His transformation had not been an isolated event, but rather the establishment of a kind of network that connected minds receptive to the knowledge realm where he now resided. It was as if he had become a living transmitter, sending advanced mathematical knowledge to any consciousness capable of receiving it. During a particularly cold April night, something extraordinary happened that confirmed the most disturbing theories about the ongoing nature of Timothy's presence. Professor Hartwell was alone in the hut, copying equations for later analysis, when he distinctly heard a familiar voice whispering complex calculations. It was Timothy's voice, recognizable but carrying impossible harmonies that made the air vibrate subtly. "Professor," the voice said, emanating from the very equations on the walls, "thank you for staying and documenting what happened here. The knowledge I am sharing needs to be preserved for those who will come after. There will be others, like me, other children, who will be called on the same journey, and they will need guides to navigate the transformation." Hartwell tried to answer, but found that his voice completely failed. It was as if Timothy's presence existed at a frequency that could reach human minds, but didn't necessarily allow for two-way communication. He could hear and understand, but he could not establish direct dialogue with the transformed consciousness. "My parents are fine," Timothy continued, his voice echoing with a serenity that contrasted dramatically with the suffering that had characterized his last days of physical existence. "They were waiting for me in the place where all mathematical possibilities coexist. Josiah now understands why he has always been attracted to the stars, and Martha finally knows the secret pattern she saw in the flowers she grew. We have all become part of something much bigger and more beautiful than any human mind could ever imagine." During this extraordinary communication, the equations on the walls flashed with increased intensity, and Hartwell could briefly see ethereal forms moving between the symbols. For a few precious seconds, he glimpsed what appeared to be a family reunited, but transformed into something made of pure mathematical light. It was Timothy, along with two adult figures, who could only be Josiah and Martha Caldwell, all existing in a state that completely transcended normal human biology. "Teacher," Timothy's voice said as the visions faded, "preserve this place. Protect the equations I left. In future decades, perhaps centuries, other young minds will be called to the same fate. When that happens, they will need to find these walls and use the knowledge I have documented as a map to navigate their own transformation. The suffering I have experienced can be avoided if those who come after have access to the path I have traced." When Timothy's presence finally faded, leaving only the soft glow of the equations, Professor Hartwell understood that he had witnessed something that would forever change the way humanity understood the limits of consciousness and the fundamental nature of reality. Timothy Caldwell had become something beyond death and beyond life as we normally understand it, a guiding force for future evolutions of the human mind. Over the next few weeks, Hartwell organized a careful preservation of the cabin, documenting every equation, every symbol, every mark Timothy had left. He realized that he was creating an archive for future generations, a navigational manual for other young minds who might be called upon for the same extraordinary journey through the mathematical mysteries of the cosmos. 50 years have passed since that freezing winter of 1867 in the Ozarks of Missouri. The Caldwell cabin remains preserved by a secret organization of academics that Professor Hartwell established before his death in 1893. The documents he left behind, housed in university archives under carefully chosen pseudonyms, tell a story that few dare to believe, but which continues to repeat itself in different parts of the world. What Hartwell predicted proved prophetic. Over the following decades, cases similar to Timothy Caldwell's were quietly documented in faraway places. An 11-year-old girl in